Media Influence, Challenging the Perception on Poverty by Kinsey Luttrell. This presentation will discuss how our idea of the deserving and undeserving poor is portrayed in the media and how that influences our idea of poverty. This presentation will also explain graphs and data about poverty in the media, as well as theories about media influence in our lives. There are two categories that impoverished people fall into in the minds of many. The deserving poor are those who others think should have taken advantage of the opportunities but haven't done so out of their own laziness and lack of initiative. The idea of the deserving poor comes from early industrial capitalism, which declared that workers who were able-bodied but unemployed deserved poverty. Thus, this group of poor people are poor because they chose to be and therefore are deserving of their poverty. On the other hand, the undeserving poor are those individuals who are thought to be poor through no fault of their own. This includes those who are handicapped, mentally ill, or have some other inevitable life circumstance that impacts their ability to earn a living. Thus, the undeserving poor are worthy of sympathy, and their poverty is seen as legitimate. This distinction between deserving and undeserving poor plays a role in how elites and the public at large think about poverty. Poverty in the media. It's been found that portrayals of the undeserving poor are far less in the media. Additionally, the media tends to perpetuate stereotypes of the poor as lazy, sexually irresponsible, and criminally deviant. Because of this disproportionate and stereotypical portrayal, the public may be much more likely to view all poor people as though they deserve their poverty. What's the big deal? Accurate media portrayal of poverty is important because public opinion has an inevitable impact on policy. Additionally, if attitudes on poverty-related issues are driven by inaccurate and stereotypical portrayals of the poor, then the policies favored by the public and political elites may not adequately address the true problems of poverty. In this way, the media has a direct influence on public opinion and policy. Therefore, it is essential for depictions of poverty to be both accurate and non-stereotypical. This graph illustrates how poverty has been discussed in the media from the 1960s to 2008. The graph is in stacked error format, with each year adding up to 100%. Thus, we can see that the 1960s framed poverty heavily towards misery and neglect, nearly 80%. This framing may have led to more people being seen as undeserving poor. At the beginning of the 21st century, however, nearly 80% of media coverage framed poor individuals as lazy, with less than 10% framed towards misery and neglect. Therefore, it can be argued that the poor started being seen by the public as deserving poor, in part because of media coverage. Graph illustrating government generosity towards the poor from 1960 to 2008. As shown in the graph, government generosity towards the poor grew exponentially during the 1970s and peaked during the early 1980s. This was around the same time that media portrayals of poverty heavily framed the undeserving poor. For example, they framed misery and neglect, disorders, and other barriers above everything else. After the early 1980s to 2008, There has been a steady decline of government generosity towards the poor. Although the graph shows fluctuating rates of generosity since the 1980s, government generosity hasn't even closely reached the peak of generosity towards the poor that it did in the early 80s. By looking at these two graphs, we can see that generosity toward the poor steadily went down as media depictions of the poor as lazy went up. Therefore, the data suggests that the media at least slightly influenced government generosity. How the media influences us. The media impacts our thoughts by making issues more salient. An issue that is more salient to you will increase the likelihood that you will remember that issue. Additionally, it's been found that media influence not only impacts public opinion, but also impacts public action. In an experiment, it was found that participants exposed to a lot of media about a sugar shortage altered their shopping habits. Participants exposed to less media were less likely to alter their shopping habits. Thus, media coverage on poverty can not only influence public opinion on poverty, but can also influence public action or lack thereof. Disproportionate coverage on the deserving poor makes the issue more salient in the mind of the public and less likely that action will be taken. If the public is convinced the poor deserve their poverty, then they will take no action to help those impoverished. Cultivation theory. This theory says that TV acts as the primary socializing agent in modern society. In other words, TV is where people learn about their culture and cultivate their social reality. For example, because TV tends to portray women in a stereotypical manner, it has been found that heavy, long-term TV watchers tend to view women in more sexist ways. Considering poverty in the media, cultivation theory would say that because the media portrays the poor as either undeserving or deserving, sadly, mostly as deserving, the long-term viewers will accept these portrayals as reality. Thus, the media's binary and often negative portrayal of poverty is how an entire generation is learning to view poor people. Cultivation theory model. This cultivation theory model illustrates that TV viewing produces incidental information, which then creates social reality. Therefore, TV viewing of the undeserving versus deserving poor produces information about those in poverty, and that information leads to the construction of social reality. Then the media heavily influences our perception of poverty. Media influence is at the heart of cultivation theory. It is important to understand how the media influences our perceptions of poverty, because our perceptions influence policy. Because the media has increasingly been portraying poor people as deserving, and media exposure can lead to social construction of reality, it is vital to do your own research about poverty. Don't just accept the media's portrayals as truth when it comes to poverty. Thank you for listening to my presentation about depictions of poverty in the media. If you have any questions or need clarification about anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks again.